In the autumn of 1798, 17 travelers disappeared along a 20-mile stretch of the Wilderness Road in southeastern Kentucky. Each vanished without a trace, leaving behind only abandoned horses and scattered belongings that told no story of their fate. What makes these disappearances truly chilling isn't just their number, but the fact that local authorities deliberately buried every record of the investigation that followed. For over 2 centuries, the truth about the Hardin family farm remained hidden in sealed court documents, until a county clerk's discovery in 1987 revealed the most disturbing case of organized murder in early American frontier history. The documents describe a killing operation so methodical, so perfectly disguised as Christian charity, that it operated for 8 years without detection. Before we continue with the story of the farm that became Kentucky's first house of horrors, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We're about to uncover secrets that powerful families tried to keep buried forever. And tell us in the comments, what state are you listening from? We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers. The discovery that would eventually expose the Hardin family's crimes began not with screams in the night, but with the simple act of bureaucratic housekeeping in a dusty courthouse basement. Southeastern Kentucky in 1798 was a land caught between civilization and wilderness, where the promise of prosperity drew thousands westward along treacherous mountain paths. The Wilderness Road, carved through the Cumberland Gap by Daniel Boone 2 decades earlier, had become the primary artery for settlers moving west from Virginia and the Carolinas. This narrow, winding trail stretched for over 200 miles through some of the most unforgiving terrain in North America, where a single misstep could mean death from exposure, wild animals, or the countless human predators who haunted the frontier. Along this treacherous path, dozens of small communities had sprouted like wildflowers after rain, each one a beacon of hope for families seeking new beginnings in the untamed frontier. These settlements served as crucial waypoints where exhausted travelers could rest, resupply, and gather information about the dangers that lay ahead. The success or failure of these communities often depended on their ability to provide safe haven for the constant stream of migrants who passed through their borders. The township of Millfield sat at a crucial bend in the road, where the trail descended from the rocky ridges into the fertile valley of Beaver Creek. With barely 300 souls, it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. The town had been established in 1794 by a group of Virginia Baptists seeking religious freedom, and their influence could be seen in every aspect of community life. Sunday services were mandatory for all residents, and the town council enforced strict moral codes that governed everything from drinking to dancing. The settlement centered around Hendrick's General Store, a weathered log building that served as both trading post and informal courthouse. Jeremiah Hendricks, a gruff former militiaman who had fought Indians alongside Daniel Boone himself, ran the establishment with an iron fist and a keen eye for profit. His store stocked everything a traveler might need: gunpowder, salt, whiskey, blankets, and the latest news from the civilized world beyond the mountains. Nearby stood the Cumberland Inn, a 2-story structure that represented the height of frontier luxury. Martha Crane, the widow who operated the inn, had arrived from Philadelphia 5 years earlier with enough money to build the finest accommodations between Lexington and the Virginia border. Travelers could find a hot meal and a clean bed for 2 bits a night, along with the kind of civilized conversation that reminded them of the world they had left behind. The town's spiritual center was the New Jerusalem Baptist Church, a modest log building that could hold the entire population during Sunday services. Reverend Ephraim Cole, a Harvard-educated minister who had abandoned a comfortable Boston pastorate for frontier missions, delivered sermons that blended traditional theology with practical advice for survival in an unforgiving land. His presence gave Millfield a sense of legitimacy that attracted settlers who might otherwise have passed through without stopping. Among Millfield's most respected residents were the Hardins, Ezekiel, his wife Temperance, and their 3 adult children, sons Caleb and Josiah, and daughter Mercy. The family had arrived in the spring of 1791, claiming to be refugees from brutal Indian raids that had devastated their previous home in eastern Virginia. They quickly established themselves as pillars of the small community, with Ezekiel serving as a lay preacher who assisted Reverend Cole, and Temperance organizing charitable efforts for struggling families who arrived with little more than the clothes on their backs. Ezekiel Hardin was a man who commanded respect through sheer force of personality. Standing well over 6 feet tall with the broad shoulders of a lifetime laborer, he possessed the kind of physical presence that made other men step aside when he entered a room. His deep voice could fill the church without effort, delivering sermons that moved listeners to tears with their passionate descriptions of divine love and terrible warnings about eternal judgment. Those who heard him preach often remarked that he seemed to speak with the authority of someone who had personally witnessed both heaven and hell. Temperance Hardin was equally impressive in her own way. A small, delicate woman with prematurely grey hair and hands that never seemed to rest, she had quickly become the community's unofficial physician. Her knowledge of healing herbs was encyclopedic, and she could treat everything from broken bones to difficult births with a skill that seemed almost supernatural. More than one family owed their lives to her midnight visits during times of crisis, and her reputation for medical miracles had spread throughout the county. Their children appeared to be perfect examples of frontier virtue. Caleb, the elder son at 26, possessed his father's imposing physical presence and his mother's gentle demeanor. He worked the family farm with tireless dedication while finding time to help elderly neighbors with their own crops. Josiah, 24, was smaller but more intellectual, often serving as the community's unofficial schoolmaster during the winter months when farm work slowed. At 22, Mercy was considered one of the most beautiful young women in the county, with a sweet disposition that made her popular among both men and women. The Hardin farm sprawled across 400 acres of prime bottomland along Beaver Creek, 3 miles south of town. The land had cost Ezekiel nearly every penny he possessed, but the investment had proven wise. The rich soil produced abundant crops of corn and tobacco, while the creek provided water for livestock and power for a small grist mill that served the surrounding area. Visitors often remarked on the farm's unusual prosperity, noting that the Hardins seemed to have more material wealth than could be explained by farming alone. Ezekiel had built his homestead with careful attention to both comfort and security. The main house was a 2-story log structure with stone chimneys and glass windows, an almost unheard-of luxury on the frontier. The rooms were furnished with pieces that seemed far too fine for a simple farming family. Carved chairs, imported china, silver candlesticks, and books that suggested education and refinement. A massive barn could shelter 50 horses, while a network of outbuildings included a smokehouse, dairy, blacksmith shop, and what Ezekiel described as the largest root cellar in the county. What made the Hardins particularly valuable to the community was their willingness to help travelers in distress. The frontier was unforgiving to those who traveled alone or unprepared, and barely a week passed without someone arriving at the farm seeking assistance. More than once, Ezekiel had ridden out in dangerous weather to assist a broken wagon or injured horse, often inviting stranded families to shelter at his farm until repairs could be made. Such hospitality was considered a Christian duty on the frontier, but the Hardins took it to extraordinary lengths. Temperance was particularly known for her willingness to treat injured or sick travelers, regardless of their ability to pay. Her medical skills had saved countless lives, and many families continued their journeys only because of her intervention. She maintained a well-stocked infirmary in one of the outbuildings, complete with surgical instruments and medications that most frontier doctors could only dream of possessing. The family's reputation for hospitality had grown so strong that by 1798, it was common for travelers to specifically seek out the Hardin farm when planning their journey. Local guides regularly directed parties toward Beaver Creek, assuring them that the Hardins would provide fair prices for supplies and safe shelter for the night. The family's guest book, which Mercy maintained with careful attention to detail, recorded hundreds of visitors over the years, merchants, ministers, families, and solitary adventurers who had found refuge at the prosperous farm. But in the harsh reality of frontier life, where death lurked behind every tree and trust could be fatal, appearances could be more than deceiving. They could be deadly. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came on October 13, 1798, when a merchant named Samuel Fletcher failed to arrive in Lexington as scheduled. Fletcher was no ordinary traveler. He was one of the most experienced and reliable merchants on the Wilderness Road, a man whose punctuality had made him wealthy in a world where timing could mean the difference between profit and devastating loss. For 12 years he had made the dangerous journey between Virginia and Kentucky 4 times annually, carrying manufactured goods west and raw materials east. Fletcher's business partner, Thomas Greeley, had worked with the merchant long enough to know his habits intimately. Fletcher never deviated from his planned schedule without sending word, and he never took unnecessary risks that might jeopardize his valuable cargo. When Greeley received no word after 5 days, 2 days beyond Fletcher's promised arrival, he knew something catastrophic had occurred. Greeley's search began at dawn on October 18th, following Fletcher's known route backward from Lexington. He questioned innkeepers, merchants, and farmers along the way, each of whom confirmed that Fletcher had passed through on schedule. The trail remained clear until Greeley reached the vicinity of Millfield, where Fletcher seemed to have simply vanished from existence. The discovery of Fletcher's horse came at noon on the second day of searching. The distinctive bay mare was found grazing loose near Miller's Creek, still wearing its saddle but showing no signs of injury or distress. The animal appeared well fed and cared for, as if it had been deliberately released rather than abandoned in panic. Most puzzling of all, the horse's bridle had been removed and hung carefully on a nearby tree branch, an act that suggested human intervention rather than accident. Fletcher's saddlebags remained intact, containing his trading goods and a leather pouch with nearly $50 in silver coins, a fortune that represented months of dangerous work. The money's presence ruled out simple robbery, the most common explanation for frontier disappearances. Even more disturbing, Fletcher's personal effects were scattered in a deliberate line, leading away from the road toward the interior woodlands, as if he had been forced to drop them one by one while being dragged from his horse. The local constable, Jacob Winters, was a man uniquely qualified to investigate such mysteries. A former Continental Army sergeant who had served under Anthony Wayne in the Ohio campaigns, Winters possessed both the investigative skills and the stomach for violence that frontier law enforcement required. He had seen enough death and deception to know that the most obvious explanations were often the most wrong, and Fletcher's disappearance struck him as anything but ordinary. Winters organized a search party within hours of Greeley's report, gathering 12 of Millfield's most capable men for what he knew would be a difficult and potentially dangerous investigation. The searchers included Henrik Johansson, a Swedish immigrant whose tracking skills rivaled those of the local Indians, and Benjamin Stokes, a former bounty hunter who knew every hiding place within 50 miles of town. What the search party discovered defied all rational explanation. Fletcher's trail led clearly toward the Hardin farm, marked by torn fabric, caught on thorns, and occasional drops of what appeared to be blood. The signs suggested that the merchant had been alive but injured when he left the road, possibly struggling against captors who were forcing him deeper into the wilderness. But at the exact boundary of Hardin property, every trace of Fletcher's passage simply ceased to exist. The searchers spent hours examining the area where the trail ended, looking for any sign that might indicate Fletcher's fate. They found nothing. No disturbed earth, no hidden blood, no evidence of struggle. It was as if Samuel Fletcher had been lifted from the ground by invisible hands and carried away into thin air. Even Henrik Johansson, whose tracking abilities were legendary, admitted defeat when confronted with such a complete absence of evidence. When Winters questioned Ezekiel Hardin about the missing merchant, the patriarch's response was both cooperative and strangely rehearsed. Yes, Fletcher had stopped at the farm on October 13th, arriving just before sunset and seeking directions to a shortcut that would save him a day's travel to Lexington. Ezekiel had warned him against taking unfamiliar trails, especially with valuable goods and winter weather approaching, but Fletcher had insisted on trying the route. The merchant had been polite but hurried, declining Temperance's offer of a hot meal and a warm bed in favor of pressing on while daylight remained. According to Ezekiel, Fletcher had seemed nervous and distracted, constantly checking his saddlebags and looking over his shoulder as if expecting pursuit. When asked about this behavior, Fletcher had mentioned seeing strange men following him since leaving Virginia, but had dismissed Ezekiel's suggestion that he remain at the farm until a larger party could escort him to safety. The last the family had seen of him, Fletcher was riding north toward the ridge country, determined to find his shortcut despite growing darkness and threatening weather. Ezekiel's account was corroborated in exact detail by his entire family, each member providing identical descriptions of Fletcher's visit. They remembered his urgency, his dismissal of their warnings, even his precise words when declining their hospitality. Temperance recalled that the merchant had complained of stomach problems and had accepted a small bottle of her herbal medicine before departing. Caleb had offered to escort Fletcher to the ridge trail, but the merchant had refused, claiming that his business was too urgent for delays. Their consistency should have been reassuring to Constable Winters. Instead, it struck him as unnaturally perfect, like a story that had been carefully rehearsed and practiced until every detail was fixed in memory. Real witnesses, in Winters' experience, always contradicted each other on minor points while agreeing on major ones. The Hardins' account was too polished, too complete, too free of the small inconsistencies that marked genuine testimony. The constable's suspicions deepened when he noticed significant changes in the farm's layout since his last visit several months earlier. A new smokehouse had been built near the main barn, unusually large for a family operation, and constructed with thick stone walls that seemed designed for more than food preservation. Fresh earth surrounded several outbuildings, as if extensive digging projects had recently taken place. Most peculiar of all, the family's root cellar appeared to have been substantially enlarged, with new timber supports visible around an entrance that now seemed large enough to accommodate a wagon. When Winters asked about these improvements, Ezekiel explained that the family had enjoyed an exceptionally profitable harvest and had decided to invest in better facilities for storing and processing their crops. The enlarged root cellar was necessary for the increased volume of vegetables and preserved foods they planned to sell in Lexington, while the new smokehouse would allow them to cure meat for both family use and commercial sale. The explanations were reasonable and well delivered, but something in Ezekiel's manner suggested he was choosing his words with unusual care. Most disturbing of all, the family's usual warmth seemed forced during Winters' visit, their famous hospitality carrying an undercurrent of nervous energy that the constable couldn't ignore. Temperance's hands shook slightly as she served coffee, and Mercy kept glancing toward her father, as if seeking approval for every word she spoke. Even Caleb and Josiah, normally confident and outgoing young men, seemed subdued and watchful in ways that suggested they were hiding something significant. But without concrete evidence of wrongdoing, there was little Constable Winters could legally do. Fletcher's case was officially recorded as a probable highway robbery or Indian attack, his name added to the growing list of frontier casualties that marked the price of westward expansion. The merchant's horse was sold at auction to cover his outstanding debts, and within a month, Samuel Fletcher existed only in the memories of those who had known him. Yet Fletcher's disappearance would prove to be just the beginning of a pattern that would terrorize the Wilderness Road for the next 8 months, transforming a prosperous farming community into a place where travelers whispered warnings and parents kept their children close to home after dark. Throughout the winter of 1798 and into the spring of 1799, the disappearances continued with terrifying regularity that defied all rational explanation. Every 2 to 3 weeks, another traveler would vanish without explanation along the same stretch of road, creating a zone of fear that stretched for nearly 20 miles in every direction from Millfield. The victims varied dramatically in age, wealth, and traveling circumstances. Solitary merchants like Fletcher, small family groups, even heavily armed parties traveling together for mutual protection. What united them was their complete disappearance, and the fact that each had been seen heading toward or inquiring about directions to the Hardin farm before vanishing into the wilderness. Dr. Marcus Cromwell disappeared in November during his journey from Richmond to establish a medical practice in Louisville. The 43-year-old physician had been carrying his entire life's work in the form of medical instruments, books, and supplies worth over $300, an investment that represented years of saving and planning. His wagon had been found overturned near Devil's Fork, 3 miles from the Hardin farm, with the contents scattered but apparently untouched. Local authorities assumed that Cromwell had been thrown from his seat during an accident and had wandered into the wilderness in a state of confusion, eventually dying of exposure. The explanation seemed reasonable until searchers discovered that Cromwell's medical bag was missing from the wreckage. The leather satchel contained surgical instruments of exceptional quality, including a bone saw and amputation kit that would be invaluable to anyone attempting to practice frontier medicine. No wild animal would have taken such items, and ordinary thieves would have been more interested in the coins and trade goods that remained scattered around the crash site. The Henley family vanished in December during one of the worst blizzards in recent memory. Jonathan Henley, his wife Elizabeth, and their 2 young children had been seeking shelter when their wagon became mired in a snowdrift only half a mile from the Donnor Farm. According to Ezekiel's subsequent account, the family had never reached his property despite the short distance, presumably becoming lost in the storm and freezing to death in the wilderness. Their bodies were never found, despite extensive searches conducted when the weather cleared. What made the Henley case particularly disturbing was the discovery of their wagon a week after the storm. The vehicle had been pulled from the snowdrift and abandoned beside the road, cleaned of snow and apparently searched thoroughly. The family's clothing and personal belongings were gone, but their food supplies and tools remained untouched. Most puzzling of all, tracks around the wagon suggested that multiple people had worked together to free it from the drift, an act that would have required considerable time and effort in dangerous weather. January brought the disappearance of Reverend Nathan Cross, a circuit preacher carrying donations for a new church in Frankfurt. Cross was known throughout the region for his powerful sermons and his fearless travels through even the most dangerous areas of the frontier. The 50-year-old minister had survived Indian attacks, bandits, and countless natural hazards during 15 years of preaching, making his disappearance particularly shocking to communities that had come to view him as indestructible. Cross's horse was found 3 days after his disappearance, still carrying saddlebags that contained nearly $200 in church donations. The money's presence ruled out robbery as a motive, but raised disturbing questions about what kind of threat could have overcome such an experienced and resourceful man. Local authorities eventually concluded that Cross had suffered a heart attack or stroke while traveling, falling from his horse and dying somewhere in the vast wilderness that surrounded the wilderness road. Each disappearance followed the same inexplicable pattern. Abandoned horses found grazing loose or tied to trees, scattered personal belongings suggesting sudden violence or struggle, and trails that led inevitably toward Hardin property before vanishing completely. Yet whenever questioned by increasingly suspicious authorities, the Hardin family presented plausible explanations that were impossible to disprove. They had seen some of the travelers, yes, but only briefly and usually from a distance. Each victim had been warned about various dangers, bad weather, difficult terrain, reports of bandit activity, but had chosen to continue their journey despite the family's concerned advice. In several cases, the Hardins had offered food, shelter, or escort services that had been politely declined by travelers who seemed determined to maintain their schedules regardless of risk. Constable Winters found himself trapped in an impossible situation that grew more frustrating with each new disappearance. The Hardins were among the most respected families in the county, their reputation for charity and Christian virtue unquestioned by everyone except him. Ezekiel's sermons continued to draw crowds from surrounding townships, his passionate delivery and biblical knowledge impressing even educated ministers like Reverend Cole. Temperance's medical skills had saved dozens of lives during the previous summer's fever outbreak, earning her a reputation that bordered on sainthood among grateful families. To accuse such pillars of the community without ironclad proof would be professional suicide and social ostracism. Winters had seen what happened to lawmen who made accusations they couldn't prove. They found themselves friendless, unemployed, and sometimes facing charges of their own. The frontier operated on a complex web of personal relationships and mutual obligations, and attacking the wrong family could destroy a man's life more effectively than any legal proceeding. Moreover, the family's explanations, while consistently convenient, were entirely believable within the context of frontier life. The wilderness road was genuinely dangerous, plagued by bandits, hostile Indians, severe weather, and the countless natural hazards that claimed lives regularly. Dozens of travelers disappeared each year under circumstances far less mysterious than those surrounding the Donnor Farm. What made this cluster of vanishings different was purely statistical. Too many people, too close together, all last seen in the same general area. But statistics meant little in a world where evidence was everything, and evidence seemed to evaporate like morning mist whenever investigators approached the Donnor property. The family welcomed searches of their buildings and grounds, answered questions with apparent openness, and even provided volunteers for search parties that combed the surrounding wilderness for signs of the missing travelers. Their cooperation was so complete and enthusiastic that it felt almost like mockery to the increasingly frustrated constable. The first crack in the family's carefully maintained facade came from an unexpected source. 9-year-old Timothy Vaughan, whose family lived on a small homestead 2 miles east of the Donnor Farm. Timothy was known throughout the community as an imaginative child who loved to explore the woods around his family's property, often returning home with elaborate stories about the wildlife and natural wonders he had discovered during his adventures. In March 1799, young Timothy approached Constable Winters with a story that initially seemed like another product of childish imagination. The boy claimed he had been exploring the woods near Beaver Creek when he heard screaming coming from the direction of the Donnor Farm. But these weren't the kind of screams that came from accidents, arguments, or even childbirth. They were the sustained, desperate cries of someone in mortal terror, rising and falling in patterns that suggested both physical pain and psychological torment. According to Timothy, he had heard such sounds at least 5 times over the winter, always during the darkest hours of night, when decent folk should be asleep. The screaming would continue for what seemed like hours, sometimes accompanied by other sounds that the boy couldn't identify: rhythmic hammering, the creak of pulleys or ropes, and occasionally what sounded like multiple voices chanting in unison. The sounds always ended abruptly, followed by a silence so complete that Timothy wondered if he had imagined the entire episode. When Winters questioned the boy's parents, they admitted to hearing strange sounds themselves, but had dismissed them as natural phenomena common to frontier life. Animal calls distorted by wind and distance, perhaps, or the sounds of nocturnal predators hunting in the wilderness. After all, the Hardens were good Christian folk who had never given anyone cause for suspicion. What possible explanation could there be for screaming in the night coming from such a respectable household? Timothy's account might have been dismissed as childhood imagination or misinterpreted natural sounds, except for one detail that gave Constable Winters considerable pause. When pressed for specifics, the boy could accurately describe the approximate dates when he had heard the screaming, and each corresponded exactly with the estimated time of a traveler's disappearance. The correlation was too precise to be coincidental, too consistent to be explained by chance. Armed with Timothy Vaughan's disturbing testimony, Constable Winters began to build a case against the Donnor family with the methodical patience of a man who understood that accusations against such prominent citizens would require absolutely unassailable proof. He started by quietly interviewing other neighbors who lived within hearing distance of the farm, asking carefully worded questions that wouldn't reveal his growing suspicions or alert the Hardens to his investigation. What emerged from these discreet inquiries was a disturbing pattern of small inconsistencies and unexplained phenomena that had been overlooked, dismissed, or rationalized away by people who trusted the family's reputation more than their own observations. Each piece of evidence was minor when considered individually, but together they painted a picture that made Winter's blood run cold. Sarah Mitchell, whose small farm lay closest to the Donnor property, recalled several nights when she had seen unusual activity at their homestead. Lanterns moving between buildings at hours when decent folk should be sleeping, the sounds of digging and heavy construction that seemed to continue until dawn. When she had mentioned these observations to Temperance Hardin after church services, the woman had offered a reasonable explanation. The family was working on extensive improvements to their root cellar and other storage facilities, and they preferred to do such labor during cool night hours rather than waste precious daylight that could be spent tending crops. The explanation had satisfied Sarah at the time, but in retrospect she realized that the nighttime construction had continued for months longer than any reasonable building project would require. Moreover, she had never seen evidence of the massive amounts of excavated earth that such extensive digging should have produced. When pressed by Winters for more details, Sarah admitted that the sounds had often been accompanied by what seemed like muffled voices, and occasionally what might have been cries of pain or distress. Old Henrik Johansson, whose farm bordered the Hardin property to the north, reported findings that were even more troubling. The Swedish immigrant, whose tracking and hunting skills were legendary throughout the county, had discovered animal bones scattered along their shared fence line. Not the normal remains of butchered livestock, but bones that had been cracked, gnawed, and processed in ways that suggested something far more sinister than ordinary farming activities. The bones included skulls and long bones from horses, cattle, and pigs, but also smaller fragments that Johansson couldn't identify despite his extensive knowledge of local wildlife. Most disturbing of all, some of the bones showed evidence of being deliberately broken with tools, while others bore saw marks that suggested systematic dismemberment rather than natural decomposition or predator activity. When Johansson had approached Ezekiel about the mysterious bone deposits, the patriarch had offered a plausible but somehow unsatisfying explanation. Wild animals had been particularly troublesome that winter, he claimed, forcing the family to dispose of several diseased livestock carcasses by scattering the remains throughout the woods. The bone fragments were simply the result of scavengers and weather breaking down these disposed carcasses over time. But Johansson's trained eye had noticed details that contradicted this innocent explanation. The bones were too clean, too systematically processed, and too widely distributed to be the result of natural decomposition. Moreover, many of the fragments showed evidence of being boiled or otherwise treated with heat, suggesting deliberate processing rather than simple disposal of diseased animals. Most tellingly, several neighbors reported dramatic changes in the Hardin family's behavior and demeanor over the past year. The children, once friendly and outgoing members of the community, had become withdrawn and secretive, avoiding social gatherings and speaking only when directly addressed. Caleb and Josiah, who had previously been popular among young people their age, now seemed nervous and distracted during public interactions, as if constantly preoccupied with private concerns. Mercy Hardin's transformation was particularly striking. The young woman who had once been considered one of the most beautiful and vivacious girls in the county now appeared haggard and prematurely aged, her face carrying a haunted expression that made people uncomfortable. She had stopped attending social functions entirely, and when she did appear in public, she seemed to shrink from human contact as if afraid of revealing some terrible secret. Even Ezekiel's sermons had taken on a darker tone over the past months, dwelling obsessively on themes of divine judgment, the punishment of sinners, and the necessity of eliminating evil from the world. Where his preaching had once emphasized God's love and mercy, it now focused almost exclusively on wrath and retribution. Several church members had privately expressed concern about the increasingly violent imagery in his biblical interpretations. Constable Winters also discovered disturbing gaps in the Hardin family's background story that raised serious questions about their true identity and origins. While they claimed to be refugees from Indian raids in eastern Virginia, no one had been able to verify their previous residence or confirm the specific attacks that had supposedly driven them westward. Winters' inquiries to authorities in Virginia had produced no records of any Hardin family being affected by Indian violence in the time period they claimed. Moreover, the family's arrival in Kentucky seemed to mark the beginning of their documented existence, as if the Hardins had materialized from nothing in the spring of 1791. They possessed no letters from relatives, no business records from their previous life, no personal effects that predated their appearance in Millfield. For a family claiming to have lost everything to Indian raids, they had managed to arrive in Kentucky with substantial financial resources and an impressive collection of household goods. The constable's investigation received an unexpected and alarming boost in April 1799, when a traveling peddler named Isaac Brewster arrived in Millfield with information that transformed suspicion into near certainty. Brewster was a well-known figure throughout the frontier, a man whose business required him to travel constantly between settlements and who possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of events and personalities throughout the region. Brewster had spent the previous winter in eastern Tennessee, where he had heard disturbing stories about a series of disappearances that had plagued the Holston River Valley between 1789 and 1791. According to local accounts, at least 15 travelers had vanished along a remote stretch of road near a prosperous farm operated by a family named Harper. Zachariah Harper, his wife Prudence, and their 3 adult children. The similarities between the Tennessee disappearances and the current Kentucky cases were so striking that they couldn't possibly be coincidental. The pattern was identical. Travelers would be seen heading toward the Harper property and would simply vanish, leaving behind only scattered belongings and abandoned horses. Local authorities had suspected the family, but had never been able to prove their involvement, hampered by the same lack of physical evidence that was frustrating Winter's current investigation. Even more chilling were Brewster's descriptions of the Harper family themselves. Zachariah was a lay preacher, known for his powerful sermons and charitable works, while Prudence was respected throughout the region for her exceptional healing abilities. They had arrived in the valley claiming to be refugees from Indian raids, with no verifiable history before their sudden appearance. The family was known for their hospitality to travelers and had built a reputation as pillars of their community. When Brewster described the physical appearance of the Harper family, Winters felt his blood turn to ice water. Zachariah Harper had been a tall, imposing man with prematurely gray hair and penetrating eyes. Prudence was small and delicate with skilled hands and an extensive knowledge of medicinal herbs. Their children matched the ages and descriptions of Caleb, Josiah, and Mercy Harden so closely that they could have been the same people. Most damning of all, the Harper family had vanished overnight in the spring of 1791, abandoning their farm and disappearing without explanation, just as suspicion about the disappearances was beginning to focus on their property. Neighbors had found the homestead deserted, with signs of hasty departure and deliberate destruction. Buildings had been partially burned, wells had been filled with rocks and debris, and the entire farm showed evidence of systematic elimination of anything that might provide clues to the family's true identity or activities. When Tennessee authorities had finally obtained warrants to search the abandoned Harper property, they had made discoveries that still haunted the investigators who participated. Hidden throughout the woods surrounding the farm were dozens of shallow graves containing the remains of both animals and humans. The human remains included personal effects belonging to several of the missing travelers, creating undeniable evidence that the Harper family had been responsible for multiple murders. But by then, the killers had vanished completely, leaving behind only their crimes and the mystery of their true identities. A 6-month manhunt had failed to locate any trace of the Harper family, and the case had eventually been closed with the assumption that they had either died in the wilderness or fled to territories beyond the reach of American law. The implications of Brewster's revelations were staggering and terrifying. If his account was accurate, the Harden family were not merely local criminals who had committed a few opportunistic murders. They were experienced serial killers who had perfected their methods over years of practice, moving from region to region when suspicion grew too strong and leaving behind a trail of bodies that stretched across multiple states. Even worse, their current operation in Kentucky appeared to be far more sophisticated and successful than their previous activities in Tennessee. They had learned from their mistakes, developed better methods of disposing of evidence, and created a more convincing cover identity that had allowed them to operate undetected for 8 years. The number of victims in Kentucky likely far exceeded those in Tennessee, representing one of the most extensive killing sprees in American criminal history. The weight of Isaac Brewster's testimony pressed down on Constable Winters like a physical burden, but he knew that compelling as the evidence might be, it would not be sufficient to secure convictions against the Harden family in a court of law. Frontier justice moved deliberately, and judges required ironclad physical evidence before authorizing arrests that could destroy innocent lives and tear apart established communities. The constable needed proof that would stand up under the scrutiny of skeptical attorneys and suspicious juries, evidence that could not be explained away or dismissed as coincidence. The breakthrough he desperately needed came from the last source he would have expected: Mercy Harden herself. On the night of May 22, 1799, The 22-year-old woman appeared at Winter's cabin like a ghost materializing from the darkness, her face streaked with tears and her hands trembling with barely controlled terror. What she told him during the next 3 hours would finally expose the full horror of what had been happening at the Donnor Farm and provide the evidence necessary to bring Kentucky's most notorious family of killers to justice. According to Mercy's devastating confession, her family had been systematically murdering travelers for over 8 years, beginning just months after their arrival in Kentucky. But what made her testimony truly horrifying was not just the scope of their crimes, but the methodical, almost ritualistic way in which the murders had been planned and executed. The killing operation, as Mercy described it, was far more sophisticated than Winters had imagined possible. Her father, Ezekiel, had convinced the family that they were carrying out God's work by eliminating what he called unworthy souls who traveled the frontier roads. The murders weren't random acts of violence driven by greed or opportunity, but carefully planned executions that served both what Ezekiel claimed was divine justice and the family's increasingly elaborate material needs. The process began with what the family called evaluation. When promising targets approached the farm, travelers with valuable goods, significant amounts of money, or skills that the family coveted, Ezekiel would engage them in seemingly innocent conversation designed to assess their moral character. He would ask about their reasons for traveling, their families, their business dealings, and their religious beliefs, all while presenting himself as a concerned Christian neighbor worried about their safety. Based on these conversations, Ezekiel would determine whether each traveler deserved what he called judgment. The wealthy were automatically guilty of greed and materialism. Educated individuals were condemned for pride and intellectual arrogance. Families traveling with young children were accused of recklessly endangering innocent lives. Even ministers and missionaries could be found guilty of false piety or doctrinal errors that marked them as heretics deserving death. Once Ezekiel had pronounced his secret verdict, the family would spring into action with the precision of a military operation. They would invite the condemned travelers to stay the night, citing concerns for their safety on dangerous roads or offering assistance with repairs to wagons or equipment. The family's reputation for hospitality made such invitations almost impossible to refuse, especially during bad weather or when travelers were genuinely in need of help. The doomed visitors would be welcomed into the main house and treated to what appeared to be genuine frontier hospitality. Temperance would prepare elaborate meals, showcasing her cooking skills, while the children would entertain guests with music, conversation, and displays of their education and refinement. The evening would conclude with family prayers led by Ezekiel, whose powerful voice and biblical knowledge impressed even skeptical visitors. But the final course of every meal contained a carefully prepared mixture of herbs that Temperance had perfected over years of experimentation. The drug cocktail was virtually undetectable when mixed with strong coffee or whiskey, producing effects that mimicked natural exhaustion after a long day of travel. Victims would gradually become drowsy and disoriented, accepting the family's suggestion that they retire early to recover their strength for the next day's journey. The drugged travelers would awaken to find themselves bound and helpless in the farm's underground chambers, a complex network of rooms and tunnels that had been excavated far beyond what any normal root cellar would require. According to Mercy's terrified description, the subterranean complex stretched for nearly 200 yards from the main house, with multiple levels connected by stone steps and wooden ladders. The largest chamber served as what Ezekiel called his courtroom, a grotesque parody of legal proceedings complete with a makeshift judge's bench carved from limestone, iron shackles set into the stone walls, and religious symbols that had been perverted into instruments of terror. Here, Ezekiel would preside over formal trials that determined each captive's final fate, presenting evidence of their supposed sins and delivering verdicts that were predetermined before the proceedings even began. But the trials were not merely sadistic theater, they served a practical purpose in the family's twisted psychology. By framing the murders as acts of divine justice rather than simple crimes, Ezekiel had created a belief system that allowed his family to commit atrocities while maintaining their self-image as righteous Christians. Each killing became a religious duty, each victim a sacrifice offered to purify the frontier of unworthy souls. The sentences handed down in Ezekiel's underground courtroom varied according to his assessment of each victim's sins and the family's current needs. Some prisoners were kept alive for weeks or even months, forced to use their skills for the family's benefit before being executed. Dr. Cromwell, the physician who had disappeared in November, had been compelled to train Temperance in advanced surgical techniques before his death. Reverend Cross had been forced to write sermons that Ezekiel later delivered as his own, enhancing his reputation as a biblical scholar. Others faced immediate execution, usually by methods that Ezekiel claimed were biblically sanctioned. Hanging was reserved for thieves and bandits, while drowning in the underground cisterns was the fate of those guilty of pride or blasphemy. The most elaborate executions were saved for those whom Ezekiel judged to be the most wicked, a category that included wealthy merchants, government officials, and anyone who had shown skepticism about frontier religion. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Kentucky intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Mercy's testimony revealed the systematic nature of the family's crimes in terrifying detail. Each member had been assigned specific roles in both the murders and the elaborate cover-up that followed. Caleb and Josiah served as the muscle of the operation, responsible for capturing victims, maintaining the underground complex, and disposing of bodies through a limestone cave system that connected to the deepest parts of the excavated chambers. Their size and strength made them ideal for the physical demands of moving unconscious prisoners and heavy loads of earth and stone. Mercy herself had been forced to serve as the family's record keeper, maintaining detailed ledgers that documented every victim's identity, possessions, and method of disposal. Her careful handwriting filled dozens of notebooks with information that read like a merchant's inventory, except that the goods being catalogued were human lives and the transactions were murders. Each entry included the victim's name, age, appearance, estimated wealth, and personal belongings, along with notes about their final words and behavior during their imprisonment. Temperance's role was perhaps the most crucial to the operation's success. In addition to preparing the drugs that incapacitated victims, she served as the family's medical expert, keeping prisoners alive when their skills were needed and ensuring that executions proceeded without complications that might create evidence. Her knowledge of anatomy, gained through years of frontier medical practice, had been perverted into expertise in torture and murder. Most chilling of all, Temperance had developed what she called treatments for prisoners who proved uncooperative or attempted to escape. These punishments were designed to break the will without causing death, using techniques that combined her medical knowledge with psychological torture. Prisoners who refused to comply with the family's demands would find themselves subjected to calculated doses of pain and terror until they became completely submissive. The family's success in avoiding detection had depended on more than just careful planning. It required an elaborate system of disposal and deception that eliminated all evidence of their crimes. Bodies were never buried on the farm property itself, but were instead transported through the cave system to remote limestone caverns that lay several miles from the homestead. These natural chambers provided perfect conditions for decomposition, while their distance from the farm made discovery virtually impossible. Personal belongings were sorted with the efficiency of experienced merchants. Valuable items, money, jewelry, fine weapons and tools were either kept by the family or sold in distant markets where they couldn't be traced to missing persons. Less valuable objects were carefully scattered along roads throughout the region, creating false trails that suggested robbery or Indian attacks. Even victims' clothing was processed systematically, with useful garments kept for the family's use, while distinctive items were destroyed to prevent identification. The horses presented a particular challenge, since they were both valuable and easily recognized by people familiar with the victims. The family had developed relationships with unscrupulous horse traders in distant counties who asked no questions about the animals' origins. By selling the horses far from where their owners had disappeared, the Hardins created additional false trails that further confused investigations. But perhaps the most ingenious aspect of their deception was the way they used their charitable activities to deflect suspicion. Every act of kindness, every medical treatment provided by Temperance, every sermon delivered by Ezekiel served dual purposes. They genuinely helped the community while creating a reputation that made the family virtually above suspicion. Who would believe that people who saved lives during epidemics could be responsible for systematic murder? The family had even developed contingency plans for different types of investigations. If authorities became too suspicious, they would temporarily cease their killing activities while increasing their charitable works to reinforce their reputation. They had identified several escape routes that would allow them to abandon the farm quickly if discovery seemed imminent, just as they had done when leaving Tennessee years earlier. According to Mercy, the family had been planning to expand their operation significantly. They had identified several other remote farms along the Wilderness Road where similar trials could be conducted, creating a network of killing sites that would allow them to operate with even greater impunity. The ultimate goal was to establish what Ezekiel called courts of divine justice throughout the frontier, eliminating unworthy travelers on a scale that would reshape the moral character of the entire region. But what finally drove Mercy to confession was not moral awakening or sudden conscience. It was terror for her own life. She revealed that Ezekiel had grown increasingly paranoid about potential discovery and had begun to view anyone who might pose a threat as deserving of judgment. That list now included several neighbors who had asked too many questions. Isaac Brewster, the peddler, who had been making inquiries about the Tennessee disappearances, and even Constable Winters himself. More immediately terrifying, Mercy disclosed that another victim was currently being held in the underground chambers. A traveling surveyor named William Patterson, who had been captured 3 days earlier and was scheduled for trial the following night. But Patterson was not the only prisoner in the family's custody. Unknown to the outside world, they were also holding 2 other captives. A young woman named Rebecca Foster, who had been missing for over a week, and an elderly man identified as Luther Grimsby, a traveling preacher who had disappeared the previous month. The revelation that multiple victims were being held simultaneously showed how confident the family had become in their methods and how dramatically they had escalated their activities. What had begun as opportunistic murders of isolated travelers had evolved into something approaching an industrial killing operation, with prisoners being held, sorted, and executed according to an elaborate schedule that treated human life as raw material for the family's twisted purposes. Winters realized that time had run out for careful investigation and legal procedures. If Mercy's information was accurate, innocent people were going to die within hours unless immediate action was taken. But he also knew that a direct confrontation with the Hardin family would be extraordinarily dangerous. They were armed, prepared for resistance, and operating from a fortified position that they had spent years perfecting for exactly this type of situation. Constable Winters faced the most difficult decision of his law enforcement career, knowing that every choice carried deadly consequences. He could attempt to arrest the Hardin family single-handed, risking not only his own life, but potentially alerting them to escape before their current victims could be rescued. Alternatively, he could ride to Lexington for reinforcements, almost certainly condemning Patterson, Foster, and Grimsby to death, while giving the Hardins time to destroy evidence and flee to another territory where they could resume their killing spree. The choice became easier when Winters realized he wouldn't have to act alone. Henrik Johansson, the Swedish farmer whose suspicions had been growing for months, volunteered immediately when approached for assistance. The immigrant's military experience in the Swedish army and his intimate knowledge of the local terrain made him an invaluable ally for what would essentially be a combat operation. Isaac Brewster also volunteered his services, driven by guilt over his failure to expose the Harper family's crimes in Tennessee years earlier. The peddler's knowledge of the family's previous methods and his experience with frontier violence would be crucial in anticipating their likely responses to attack. 2 other men from town, Benjamin Stokes, the former bounty hunter, and Daniel Crawford, a veteran of Indian fighting, completed the hastily assembled rescue party. The plan they developed was necessarily simple, but extremely dangerous. The group would approach the Hardin farm after midnight on May 23rd. using darkness and surprise to overcome the family's defensive advantages. Their primary objective was rescuing the imprisoned victims, with capturing the killers being a secondary consideration. If the Hardins could not be taken alive, the rescuers were prepared to use whatever force necessary to prevent their escape. Mercy provided crucial intelligence about the farm's layout and the family's likely defensive positions. The underground complex had only two entrances, the main access through the enlarged root cellar and a concealed emergency exit that emerged in the woods nearly a quarter-mile from the main house. The family kept weapons cached at both locations, and Ezekiel had drilled his sons in defensive tactics designed to hold off attackers long enough for the family to escape through the cave system. The approach to the farm required crossing nearly a mile of open ground that would leave the rescuers completely exposed if detected. Johansson's tracking skills proved invaluable in identifying a route that used creek beds and tree lines to provide maximum concealment. The group moved with the silence of experienced hunters, each man understanding that discovery would likely mean death for both themselves and the prisoners they were trying to save. What they discovered when they reached the Hardin property exceeded their worst expectations, and confirmed that Mercy's testimony had actually understated the scope of her family's crimes. The farm showed clear evidence of recent excavation work far beyond what any normal agricultural operation would require. Piles of earth and stone were scattered throughout the property, while the smell of lime and decay hung in the air like a physical presence. The main house appeared normal from the outside, with warm light glowing in the windows and smoke rising from the chimneys. But as the rescuers drew closer, they could hear sounds that chilled their blood, muffled voices coming from beneath the ground, occasional screams that were quickly silenced, and the rhythmic sound of metal striking stone that suggested ongoing construction work in the underground chambers. The rescue operation began at precisely 2 a.m., when the raiders believed the family would be least alert and most vulnerable to surprise attack. Winters and Johansson approached the main entrance to the underground complex, while Stokes and Crawford positioned themselves to block the emergency exit. Brewster remained with the horses, ready to provide covering fire if the operation went wrong. The root cellar entrance proved to be far more elaborate than Mercy had described. What appeared from the surface to be a simple storage facility was actually a sophisticated fortification, with multiple defensive positions and clear fields of fire. The Hardins had spent years preparing for exactly this type of assault, creating killing zones that would allow a small number of defenders to hold off a much larger attacking force. But the raiders' greatest advantage was complete surprise. The family had grown complacent after years of successful operation, never imagining that their carefully maintained cover could be penetrated by local law enforcement. When Winters and Johansson descended into the underground complex, they found Ezekiel and his sons completely unprepared for resistance, focused instead on the grisly business of preparing their current victims for execution. The rescue of the prisoners was both easier and more horrifying than the raiders had anticipated. They found William Patterson chained in a stone cell barely large enough for a man to stand upright, weak from days without adequate food, but alive and coherent. Rebecca Foster was in worse condition, showing signs of the treatments that Temperance had used to break her resistance. Luther Grimsby was barely conscious, his health broken by weeks of captivity and psychological torture. But the prisoners were not the only occupants of the underground complex. As the raiders penetrated deeper into the cave system, they discovered evidence of the family's crimes that defied human comprehension. The limestone chambers contained a charnel house of human remains spanning nearly a decade of systematic murder. Bones, clothing fragments, and personal effects were scattered throughout multiple rooms, creating an archaeological record of atrocity that would take weeks to fully catalogue. The physical evidence was overwhelming in both scope and detail. In addition to the human remains, the raiders found the detailed records that Mercy had described, written in her careful handwriting and organized with the precision of a merchant's ledger. The notebooks contained the names, descriptions, and final possessions of 67 victims spanning 8 years, far more than the investigation had uncovered and representing one of the most extensive killing sprees in American criminal history. But perhaps the most damning evidence was discovered in what Ezekiel had called his courtroom. The underground chamber contained not only the makeshift judge's bench and religious symbols that Mercy had described, but also a collection of personal trophies taken from victims. Scalps, jewelry, weapons, and other mementos were displayed like battle honors, creating a museum of murder that revealed the full extent of the family's sadistic pride in their crimes. The capture of the Hardin family proved to be swift but violent, as Ezekiel and his sons attempted to fight their way out of the underground complex rather than face the justice they had denied their victims. The patriarch showed no surprise at being discovered, instead launching into a rambling sermon about divine judgment and the righteousness of his mission, even as gunfire echoed through the stone chambers. Caleb and Josiah fought with the desperate fury of men who knew they faced certain death if captured, using their intimate knowledge of the cave system to launch attacks from concealed positions. The battle raged through multiple chambers for nearly an hour, with the raiders forced to advance carefully through passages that the defenders had prepared as killing zones. The end came when Temperance, trapped in the main house above, attempted to destroy evidence by setting fire to the building and its contents. The flames spread rapidly through the dry timber structure, threatening to collapse the main entrance to the underground complex and trap everyone below. Faced with the choice between burning alive and surrendering, the surviving Hardins finally laid down their weapons. Only Mercy surrendered willingly, her confession having already condemned her family and sealed their fate. She was found in her room, kneeling in prayer and apparently resigned to whatever judgment awaited her. Her cooperation with the investigation had been motivated not by moral awakening, but by terror that her father's paranoia would eventually mark her for execution along with the family's other perceived enemies. The aftermath of the Hardin family's capture sent shockwaves throughout Kentucky and the broader frontier region, forcing communities to confront the terrifying reality that one of their most respected families had been systematically murdering travelers for nearly a decade. The evidence recovered from the underground complex was so overwhelming and disturbing that local authorities struggled to process the full scope of the crimes. The investigation that followed the raid revealed details that exceeded even the raiders' worst expectations. The cave system beneath the Hardin farm was far more extensive than anyone had imagined, stretching for nearly 2 miles through natural limestone caverns that the family had modified for their murderous purposes. Multiple chambers had been excavated and reinforced, creating an underground complex that could house dozens of prisoners simultaneously. The physical evidence recovered from these chambers painted a picture of systematic murder that spanned not just the 8 years the family had lived in Kentucky, but potentially decades of similar crimes in other territories. In addition to the 67 victims documented in Mercy's careful records, searchers found personal effects and human remains that suggested the true number of murders was significantly higher. Particularly disturbing was the discovery of children's clothing and toys among the recovered evidence, indicating that entire families had been murdered rather than just individual travelers. The Henley family, who had disappeared during the December blizzard, were found to have been held in the underground complex for over a week before being executed. Their children, ages 6 and 8, had been kept alive for several days after their parents' deaths before being killed, and their bodies disposed of in the deepest parts of the cave system. The trial of the Hardin family began in late June 1799 and lasted for nearly a month, drawing spectators from across Kentucky and the surrounding territories. The courthouse in Lexington was packed daily with crowds that included victims' relatives, curious onlookers, and legal experts who recognized the case as unprecedented in American criminal history. The evidence presented was so overwhelming and disturbing that the presiding judge, Honorable Samuel Whitmore, ordered portions of the testimony sealed from public view. Ezekiel Hardin's behavior during the trial shocked even experienced court observers. Rather than showing remorse for his crimes or attempting to minimize his family's responsibility, he used his testimony as an opportunity to deliver extended sermons about divine justice and the righteousness of his mission. He claimed that every murder had been sanctioned by God as part of a holy war against sin and corruption on the frontier. According to Ezekiel's twisted theology, he and his family had been chosen as instruments of divine judgment, tasked with eliminating unworthy souls who posed a threat to the moral order of Christian civilization. The money and goods taken from victims weren't theft, but righteous compensation for their sacred work. The elaborate underground complex wasn't a prison, but a courthouse where God's justice was administered according to biblical principles. His wife and sons maintained their innocence despite overwhelming evidence, insisting they had been coerced into participating by Ezekiel's religious fanaticism and threats of violence. Temperance claimed that her medical knowledge had been used against her will to keep prisoners alive, while Caleb and Josiah testified that their father had convinced them they were fighting a holy war against agents of Satan who threatened their community. These claims were contradicted by extensive evidence showing that all family members had participated willingly and enthusiastically in the murders. Mercy's detailed records included notations in different handwritings, indicating that each family member had contributed to documenting their crimes. Personal items found in their rooms included trophies taken from victims, suggesting that the killings provided psychological satisfaction rather than mere material gain. Only Mercy Hardin expressed genuine remorse for her role in the murders, though her testimony revealed that her cooperation with authorities had been motivated primarily by fear rather than moral awakening. She provided crucial details about the family's methods and helped identify many of the victims whose remains had been found in the cave system. Her willingness to testify against her family members earned her a degree of mercy from prosecutors, though she would still face severe punishment for her participation in the crimes. The sentences handed down by Judge Whitmore were swift and decisive, reflecting both the severity of the crimes and the community's demand for justice. Ezekiel, Temperance, Caleb, and Josiah Hardin were all condemned to death by hanging, with the execution scheduled for August 15, 1799. The date was chosen deliberately. It marked exactly 1 year since Samuel Fletcher's disappearance had first exposed the family's crimes and begun the investigation that led to their capture. Mercy Hardin received a sentence of life imprisonment, sparing her from execution in exchange for her cooperation with authorities and her youth at the time many of the crimes were committed. She would spend the remaining 43 years of her life in the Kentucky State Penitentiary, becoming one of the longest-serving prisoners in the institution's history. The executions drew the largest crowd in Kentucky's history to that point, with over 4,000 people traveling from throughout the region to witness the end of the frontier's most notorious family of killers. The event took on an almost carnival atmosphere, with vendors selling food and drink to spectators who had made long journeys to see justice served. Ezekiel maintained his religious fanaticism to the very end, using his final words to deliver a rambling sermon in which he cursed the community that had rejected his vision of divine justice. He predicted that God would punish Kentucky for executing his chosen servants, and that the frontier would be overrun by the very sinners his family had worked to eliminate. His wife and sons died in silence, their deaths bringing closure to one of the darkest chapters in early American criminal history. The Hardin farm was burned to the ground immediately after the executions, with every building reduced to ash and rubble in a ceremony that took on ritualistic significance for the traumatized community. The underground chambers were sealed with explosives and tons of rock, creating a tomb that would ensure the family's victims could finally rest in peace. Local authorities declared the land cursed and forbade any future construction on the site. But the legacy of the Hardin family's crimes extended far beyond their own deaths, establishing important precedents in frontier justice and fundamentally changing how communities viewed the balance between hospitality and security. The case led to new laws requiring background verification for land purchases and established protocols for investigating missing persons that would influence law enforcement practices for decades. More importantly, the Hardin case served as a chilling warning about the dangers of blind trust in religious authority and the ease with which evil could hide behind a facade of respectability. Communities throughout the frontier began questioning their assumptions about neighbors and strangers alike, recognizing that surface appearances could mask the darkest intentions. The legal proceedings also established important precedents for the use of circumstantial evidence in capital cases and the protection of witnesses who cooperated with authorities. Mercy Hardin's testimony demonstrated that family loyalty could be overcome by proper incentives and legal protections, paving the way for similar prosecutions in other complex criminal cases. The surviving records of the case were sealed by court order in 1801, with access restricted to law enforcement officials and legal scholars. This decision was made partly to protect the privacy of victims' families, but also to prevent the case from inspiring copycat crimes by other twisted individuals who might see the Hardins' methods as a blueprint for their own murderous ambitions. For nearly 2 centuries, the full truth about the Hardin family remained hidden in those sealed documents, with only fragments of the story surviving in local folklore and family traditions. The few historians who were granted access to the files were required to sign confidentiality agreements that prevented them from publishing their findings or sharing details with other researchers. Even local memory gradually forgot the specific details of the murders, transforming the story into vague tales of bad folks who had once lived along Beaver Creek. The location of the farm itself became uncertain as property lines changed and new settlers arrived who knew nothing of the area's dark history. By the mid-1800s, only a few elderly residents could accurately point out where the Hardin homestead had stood. The rediscovery of the case files in 1987 finally allowed historians to piece together the complete story of Kentucky's first family of serial killers, but even today, many questions remain unanswered. The cave system where the family disposed of their victims has never been fully explored, and authorities believe additional remains may still be hidden in the deepest passages that were too dangerous for 18th-century investigators to access. Modern forensic techniques could potentially reveal much more about the family's crimes, but the sealed caverns would be extremely difficult and expensive to excavate. Local authorities have shown little interest in reopening what they consider a historical matter, preferring to let the dead rest undisturbed rather than risk new revelations that might traumatize descendants of the victims. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the Hardin case has forced historians to reconsider other unexplained disappearances along frontier roads throughout the early American period. How many other respectable families might have been hiding similar secrets? How many missing travelers were victims not of random violence, natural hazards, or Indian attacks, but of carefully planned murders by people they trusted? The statistical analysis of frontier disappearances reveals troubling patterns that suggest the Hardin family may not have been unique. Clusters of vanishings near other prosperous, charitable families have been identified in Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia during the same time period. While none of these cases have been definitively linked to systematic murder, the similarities are striking enough to warrant further investigation. The answers to these questions died with Ezekiel Hardin on that August morning in 1799. But the questions themselves serve as a chilling reminder that evil often wears the most innocent face. The greatest horrors in human history have frequently been committed by those who believed they were doing God's work, and the frontier period of American expansion created countless opportunities for such twisted individuals to operate with impunity. The Hardin case also highlights the vulnerability of isolated communities that valued reputation over evidence and trust over vigilance. The family's success depended not just on their own criminal skills, but on their neighbors' willingness to dismiss uncomfortable evidence in favor of maintaining social harmony. The price of that willingness was measured in human lives. This mystery shows us that the frontier justice of early America was often more complex and disturbing than traditional histories have acknowledged. The expansion westward created not just opportunities for honest settlers seeking new lives, but also perfect hunting grounds for predators who understood how to exploit the trust and desperation of vulnerable travelers. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed about the Hardin family's crimes, or might there be even darker secrets still buried beneath the Kentucky soil? Could similar families have operated in other frontier regions without ever being discovered? Leave your comment below and share your theories about this case. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.